Hi! It's finally time for me to make a video entirely about the GOATs, the Year 24 group, an excuse to talk at length about shoujo manga from the 1970s. I am so excited. So, shoujo tends to get overlooked in the greater anime and manga community, but the changes to the demographic that were pioneered by this Year 24 group have had an impact, not only on shoujo, but manga in general. From influences felt in well-known works like Berserk, to influencing how manga was distributed. The revolutionary manga artists that were cooking in shoujo during the 1970s have contributed a lot to this medium that we all love. The Year 24 group is an unofficial grouping that critics, academics, and freaks like me who are really into shoujo manga use to refer to a notable group of women who began making waves in the 1970s. The Year 24 is a reference to when these women were born, the 24th year in the Showa era, or alternatively 1949. Funnily enough though, not all manga artists that are considered a part of this group were actually born in that year. In fact, most of them aren't. However, they are all still around the same age, like 1948, 1950, 51, just those kinds of age birthdays. So I guess it makes sense why they're talked about as if they were all this monolithic, everyone was born in the same year kind of way. These women brought explorations of gender, politics, sexuality, and psychology to shoujo, and these progressive topics became a defining trait of the Year 24 group and their manga. This group of manga artists were teenagers during the counterculture movements of the 60s and the New Left student protest movements, and the manga written during this golden age of shoujo manga embodied and was empowered by the youthful rebellions going on around this time. They explored sexuality and gender in a non-conforming way, tackling gender issues with characters that blurred the lines between man and woman, and there was a focus on homosocial or homoerotic relationships, if you've ever wondered why shoujo is like that.
You boys are the homosexual supporting cast.
But before we get into the weeds of how shoujo manga has changed, first, we have to establish where it started, and the landscape that the members of the Year 24 group started their careers in. Shoujo magazines became a thing in the early 1900s, with the first Shoujo Kai starting publication in 1902. These magazines contained shoujo's shosetsu, which were illustrated novels and poems for girls, not manga. Shoujo shosetsu helped establish a girls' culture and eventually created or inspired major themes that we find a lot in shoujo manga. This would include things like Class S literature, which is pretty much just romantic friendships between girls, a precursor to Yuri. It's not just narrative conventions that were born in these early magazines and novels, though. We also saw illustrations setting the foundations for common art conventions within shoujo. The slender body, the large eyes, and emphasis on fashion. The shoujo girlies have always been stylish, and it's also what makes shoujo such a great time capsule for fashion trends in a way that shonen just doesn't capture as well, in my opinion. In its early days, shoujo manga was primarily short, lighthearted, and mundane, usually set in ordinary settings like a school. We also saw a lot of melodrama and stories about young girls who would have tragic storylines with their mothers, be it separation by death or other circumstances like amnesia. And many of these stories followed a Cinderella-esque type of storyline with the evil, abusive stepmother. So that was kind of something I thought was interesting and had this very fairy tale-esque vibe to early shoujo. This isn't to say every single shoujo manga that ever existed before the 1970s is described like this. It's just what was normal, what was typical. And while there were some female manga artists like Machiko Hasegawa and Toshiko Ueda, they were not the norm. This is notable because men and women are socialized differently, with different expectations placed upon them and different experiences as they reach adolescence and beyond. And these differences are more often than not factored into the stories that are written and the way certain themes are explored. And without getting into all the ways that misogyny harms both men and women, it is nice to see people like you doing things you might want to do. I don't know about you guys, but it seems to be a very common experience in children to be interested in something and may be discouraged from doing it because that field is seen as typical of the opposite gender, like men who might be into nursing or caretaking or other traditionally feminine roles would be ridiculed for pursuing such things, and women or girls who might be interested in STEM or anything that is male-dominated might be discouraged from exploring those things because it's not ladylike, it's not what the girls are supposed to do. Luckily, I don't think this is as common as it used to be, which is great. People should just be able to do whatever they want. Skipping through manga history, shoujo did see innovations prior to the Year 24 group, with artist Katsuki Matsumoto introducing more sophistication and avant-garde approaches like Art Deco to the demographic. But when the Second Sino-Japanese War hit in 1937, innovations in manga and shoujo manga were put on the back burner with things like increased censorship and paper rationing. This war lasted until 1945 and was considered a part of World War II. They had a lot of things going on during this time, and unfortunately for people who are really into fiction and manga and all that, manga wasn't one of those things. People were still making manga, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. Everything was negatively impacted by the war. But they bounced back. The post-war era brought a lot of creativity and a lot of changes to manga in general. Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Astro Boy, is responsible for a lot of manga and anime innovation, being considered the father of manga. He, as well as other manga artists, started telling stories targeting younger audiences with intense drama and serious themes, influenced by Gekika, which is basically just adult comics, or like comics intended for adults. It's a separate category from manga, from what I've gathered, so while English fans might consider it all one and the same, they were two different things. We also see shonen manga embrace longer narrative stories that continue from chapter to chapter instead of short vignettes that had been typical at the time. This format was brought over to shoujo manga with Tezuka's series Princess Knight, a magical girl prototype series that was also very inspired by Takarazuka Revue. This series is pretty notable for the way that Tezuka plays with gender, since the main character is a girl pretending to be a male prince. But she also has the blue heart of a boy and the pink heart of a girl, so she's low-key both a girl and a boy. Love that for her. Princess Knight marked a turn in shoujo, as before shoujo manga was just gag strips and little comics to teach morals to children. It's the first narrative-driven shoujo manga and is considered the first modern shoujo manga, and helped set the stage for many of the themes and settings those in the Year 24 group explored. You know, like gender, fantastical European settings, and the likes. As shoujo manga continued to develop, we begin to see a distinct style emerge for the demographic, through the influence of Jojuga. Throughout the 50s, shoujo manga really set itself apart as its own category, as we saw shoujo manga be broken up further into sad, happy, and scary manga. Guys, Denji wanted to be in the video! As we roll into the 60s, magazines started competing with television, and we saw many weekly manga magazines emerge as the monthly magazines closed. The idea being that if manga was coming out more often, it would hold readers' attention in a competing world where television was on like every day. I don't know what television schedules were like back in the 60s, but you would get new things like weekly, or I think weekly, I don't know. But it would be like new entertainment, and with television being relatively newer to be adopted into most households, it was still a novelty, so that was cool, and manga had to compete with that to continue being a source of entertainment. And these weekly magazines held contests where readers could submit their manga for publication to fill the need of weekly content. This allowed for many female manga artists to get their foot in the publishing door. It also helped that many of the male manga artists that started their careers in shoujo did eventually move on to create shonen manga, leaving openings in the industry for a new generation of talent. These new female manga artists came onto the scene and brought us a wider variety of stories. We saw romantic comedies being introduced to the shoujo landscape, darker and more taboo story materials, and even ugly and grotesque character designs were starting to become more of a thing, and even the first ever sex scene published in shoujo manga with the series Fire. By the end of the 1960s, most shoujo manga artists were women, and the shoujo manga was now distinctly different from shonen. I also think it's worth noting that by this time, most shoujo magazines were predominantly manga now instead of the novels that they used to house. The 1970s is considered the golden age of shoujo manga, likely due to the continued innovation and the creativity that pushed the boundaries for what was even allowed, and allowed for more complex stories to be told to young girls and teens. These more complex stories are what put shoujo on the map, gaining recognition from critics that had previously considered shoujo manga childish and unserious. Shoujo manga overall was also beginning to reflect the attitudes of movements that challenged the strict social standards across the world, like the sexual revolution and the women's liberation. Okay, so now that we've had a little shoujo manga history lesson, who makes up the Year 24 group, and how exactly did they change shoujo manga? With this being an unofficial grouping, there's probably a little bit of inconsistency with who is and isn't regarded a part of the Year 24 group, but most sources on the internet have these names that I'm about to share with you guys, and how they inspired or changed shoujo, which is pretty cool. Y'all know and love her. Moto Hagio is considered the most influential member of this unofficial group, making her professional debut in 1969. Moto Hagio brought shoujo manga to the mainstream, and her contributions made critics take the demographic more seriously. She's most known for her works The Plo Clan, They Were 11, and The Heart of Thomas, and with her being the most influential, we will talk about her a lot in this video. The next person on the list, and also the one we talk about the next most, is Keiko Takemiya, who began her career in 1967. She's credited with creating the shonen ai genre, and just BL in general, and she even drew the first gay kiss in shoujo manga. Around here, she's most well known for Kazukino Uta, but she also had other notable works like Toward the Terra, which is a shonen series. Riyoko Ikeda is most well known for her works The Rose of Versailles and Dear Brother. She began her career as a manga artist in 1967, and her inclusion in the group is a little bit debated since her style of storytelling was more epic stories instead of the introspective psychological stories most of this group became known for. However, she was one of the most popular female manga artists in the 1970s, and she also tackled themes of gender and queerness in her works. She even has a manga that I think was also made in the 70s called Claudine about a trans person, which I haven't read it, so I don't know if it ages well, but I've always heard good things about it, so that's pretty cool. Also, this doesn't really fit in the script anywhere, but Riyoko Ikeda is also like a trained musician, like singer. This girl's just doing so many things, and I love that for her. Yasuko Aoki, who made her debut at the age of 15 in 1963, helped pioneer shonen ai and brought more masculine characters to the feminine and androgynous genre. She's most known for her work from Eroka with Love. Toshie Kihara debuted in 1969 and is best known for her work Mari Toshingo, which is a shonen ai story about two young men at the start of the Showa era. She is a part of the BL pioneers. Minori Kimura entered the manga scene at the age of 14 in 1964. Her work sought to explore topics that would interest women, like sexuality and work, and she even wrote feminist ideals into her stories. She's most known for her short stories like Nanohana Hateke no Kochiragawa and The People Who Live in the Stars. Yumika Oshima debuted in 1968 and became known for her visual style and panel design that forced the reader to take in the page as a whole instead of following sequential panel layout. She's known for her manga Birth, or Tanjo, which depicted teen pregnancy, which was a taboo topic that hadn't been explored in shoujo manga. She's also credited with popularizing the cat girl with her work The Star of Cottonland, so cat girls are all her fault. I love a good cat girl, cat boy though, so we love that in this house. Nanae Sasaya started her career in 1970, and she became known for her horror stories and occult themes, something that was different from the lighthearted and comical stories that had been the norm in shoujo previously. She's most known for her works Dartmoor no Shonen and her autobiographical work Okame Hachimoku. Minako Yamada made her debut in 1969 and is most known for her series Armageddon, a series of loosely connected stories that all explore the end of the world and how humanity perseveres. Ryoko Yamagashi made her professional debut in 1969, but had entered and became a semi-finalist in the Shoujo Friend in 1966. She's known for her art nouveau style and occult themes, and around here, She's known for being the creator of Yuri, kind of. She's the author of the first manga to feature a lesbian relationship, Shiroi Heia no Futari. And that's our group! But how exactly did these women gain the power to revolutionize the world? These women all started their careers with heavy limitations on their creativity and the types of stories they were allowed to publish. Moto Hagio actually had many ideas rejected at her first magazine, Kodansha's Nakayoshi, and since this was really early in her career, she wasn't so sure she had much of a future as a manga artist. She wanted to write sci-fi and do all these different things that just weren't in line with the more high-paced sports stories that were trendy at the time. Wild to think that she felt she wouldn't be able to make it at one point, knowing the trajectory of her career. However, there was a Shoujo Manga magazine that was a bit more willing to take risks and let their manga artist push the boundaries of Shoujo Manga. Shogakukan's Basatu Shoujo comic, now called Betsukami, was a sister magazine of Shoujo comic, or Shokami, that was released monthly, while Shokami was released weekly throughout the 70s, and then twice a month after 1978. Many of the Year 24 group published in Betsukami. In fact, there was one editor at Shogakukan in particular that comes up a lot when looking at the Year 24 group and their creative freedoms. Junaya Yamamoto. In an interview, Moto Hagio stated that Yamamoto got to a point where he wouldn't even look over her roughs for shorter stories, instead accepting whatever she'd come up with and just waiting until it was all done to read it, giving her trust and creative freedom. Yamamoto would only ask what was planned for the longer running series, which makes sense because that's more of an investment, so you kind of maybe need to know what you're getting into before you agree to it. Shout out to him for seeing the vision. This sort of loosening of the reins is what allowed for the Year 24 group to do their thing, making headway in what shoujo manga could be. Keiko Takemiya worked with Basatu, publishing her work Sunroom Nite in December of 1970, and I'm going to pronounce it right this time, sorry to anyone who watched my BL video. It is not Sunroom Night, I don't know why I thought it was. It's Sunroom Nite, in the sunroom. Keiko Takemiya was one of the OG fujoshis. She wanted to tell stories about boys in love, inspired by films like Death in Venice and novels by Hermann Hesse. She cooked up what would eventually become Kazeduki no Uta and created a condensed early draft in 1970 that she sought to publish. However, even though Basatu was more lax, Takemiya still wasn't able to be upfront about her plans. Kazuki no Uta had already been rejected since its focus was on male protagonist and an entirely male cast. Also, boys being in love could be a little controversial. She was slated to publish a different story in the December 1970 issue, Yukito Hoshito Tenshito, or Snow and Stars and Angel and ... But there was a great swap up. Keiko Takemiya made some alterations to her idea, creating the character Angel to be the mandatory girl. She's not exactly a protagonist, but the three characters, Serge, Angel, and Etoile, serve as an ensemble cast together, arguably sharing the lead depending on how you look at it. This made it easier for Takemiya to tell her story and skirt it through the publishing. But the thing that really allowed for Sunroom Nite to see the light of day is the fact that Takemiya waited until the very last second to get her manga in, putting the magazine in the position of scrapping it and not having enough content for their issue, and also not having the promised Takemiya story, or publishing as is. No time for revisions. And it all went according to plan. Takemiya got to tell her story, with enough changes that she knew the magazine would publish it anyway and she wasn't at risk of, losing her job or anything. Was it a little scummy to do? Sure, but we got the first male-male kiss in shoujo manga because of it, and probably laid the groundwork for Shonen Ai to exist. Sunroom Nite is the very first Shonen Ai, or BL manga, and believe it or not, the conception of BL did a lot for shoujo. Pushing the boundaries of what kind of stories could be told allowed for more creative freedom, and also brought more revolutionary ideas to shoujo manga. Takemiya also opened the floodgates of BL onto the traditional publishing scene, although it does seem that Shonen Ai in shoujo manga influenced BL doujin as well, although I'm not really sure how much of a doujinshi scene there was prior to the mid-70s, considering Comiket didn't exist until the mid-70s. I'm sure there was fan communities, but it seemed to be more of a larger community after after the first Shonen Ai existed. But I could be completely off base with that. It's a little hard to research fan communities, especially prior to the existence of the internet. Keiko Takemiya took her connections and introduced Moto Hagio to an editor at Basatu, being Yamamoto. And this opened doors for Hagio. Basatu would publish her previously rejected manga ideas, and this gave Moto Hagio the confidence to make the move to Tokyo, which was across the country from her parents' home in Fukuoka. Keiko Takemiya and Moto Hagio actually became friends after Hagio's editor assigned her to work as Takemiya's assistant, and the two eventually moved in together, renting a home in Oizumi Gakuensho, Nerima, Tokyo. The two actually lived near Nori Masuyama, a woman who is just as influential despite not actually being a manga artist. Nori Masuyama, just like me, was a shoujo manga enthusiast, and she sought to support the demographic and help it grow past its shallow roots. She befriended Moto Hagio through being pen pals after discovering Hagio's work in the magazine Nakayoshi. She was also friends with Keiko Takemiya and supported Takemiya in her pursuit to create Shonen Ai. According to an interview with Moto Hagio, these two were fujoing out and didn't understand why it just didn't do the same for Hagio. Completely off topic, I think it's so funny that Takemiya and Masuyama were like, wow, we love men being in love. Why doesn't this do anything for you, Hagio? And Hagio's just like, I don't know, man. It took a beautifully tragic story to get Moto Hagio interested in BL at all whatsoever. Hagio is so real for that. Girl, me too. These three women, living close together, created a space for themselves kind of based off of the 19th century French literary salons, nicknaming it Ozumi Salon. The salon's goal? Uplifting shoujo, of course. But it wasn't just these three that would show up. Many shoujo manga artists would visit, including those who were considered a part of the Year 24 group. There was a real community here of passionate people who wanted to help this demographic of manga grow past the constraints it has been in, and this community also benefited from one another. Nori Masuyama would share things that she was interested in with Takemiya and Hagio, novels like Demian by Hermann Hesse that would go on to be heavy influences for both manga artists. But it wasn't just the friendships that held influence. It was also the types of stories other members of the Year 24 group were getting away with publishing. Yumiko Oshima's manga, Birth, which ran from 1970 to 1971, was controversial for tackling the topic of teen pregnancy. I also think it might be the first shoujo manga ever to talk about teen pregnancy, and even to this day, it doesn't come up all that often. However, the controversial nature of Birth did prove how far shoujo manga had come, since many of the members of the Year 24 group had started their careers just a few years prior. Teen pregnancy is a topic that is a bit more grown up than what shoujo manga had been stereotyped as, and would kind of only be interesting to teenagers and older. Birth really honed in on targeting this older age range, showing that shoujo manga wasn't just for your elementary schoolers anymore, and that the medium could be used to explore mature themes. Seeing such a story be published in Margaret magazine did make Moto Hagio feel like some of her ideas that she'd initially thought would never even see the light of day may in fact be possible to publish. Hagio had been inspired to write a doomed Shonen Ai story after going with Takemiya to see the film This Special Friendship, which focused on two schoolboys who shared a romantic bond, and the story ends with the younger boy getting rejected and committing suicide. Hagio was so intrigued by this that she decided to write a story where the ending of This Special Friendship was basically the start of her own. The Heart of Thomas follows this formula in an exploration of grief, trauma, and grappling with understanding feelings of love. However, despite Hagio starting this and working on it for herself, it took some time before Moto Hagio was allowed to write The Heart of Thomas in its full glory. This story started public life as something else, something smaller, something that plucked the characters out of The Heart of Thomas and put them in a similar setting to tell a similar story. The November Gymnasium. A story that followed a boy transferring to a new school only to find another boy who could basically be his twin, that is idolized by those at the school. Kind of in a he's the prettiest boy at the party and I want to kiss him way. The story explores the grief of trying to get to know someone after they're gone, and the missed connection. It's also said that the story has a romance between Thomas and Eric, the two boys that look alike, but it did not feel that way when I read it. Maybe something got lost in translation, but the only thing akin to romance I saw was Oscar being really into Thomas. Also, is this the second male-male kiss in shoujo manga? Instead, To me, the characters of Thomas and Eric explore the ideas of expectations, familial connections, and reckoning with your family not being what you thought it was. This is compounded with Eric's parents fighting and him thinking they're getting a divorce, causing him to act out while he internally freaks out about his father's accusations that his mom has a secret lover. The way the manga plays out, these topics are taken seriously, and the way that the themes of the November Gymnasium are explored would have been maybe a tad out of place in the previous decades of shoujo manga. The November Gymnasium was published in November of 1971 after Moto Hagio moved over from Kodansha's publishing house to Shogakukan in order to have more creative freedom. And watching other manga artists like Yumiko Oshima explore taboo topics in their works inspired Hagio to take a risk and tell her more ambitious stories. 1971 also saw the innovation and the birthplace of Yuri manga in Riyoko Yamagishi's Shiroi Heian no Futari, which is actually published in February of that year. While it's not the first manga to feature a romantic relationship between girls, the plot became established as an archetype for Yuri, and is considered the first Yuri manga. Rosine and Simone literally created the Candy Girl and Crimson Rose trope. I also think it's worth noting that most manga featuring romantic relationships between girls that came before this would fall under Class S. I say most, actually I think it's all. Class S was a type of literature that serves as a precursor to Yuri, but the relationships were seen as a phase in schoolgirls, and the girls are expected to marry men as adults. I go more in depth in this in my History of Yuri video, if you were interested. But where Shiroi Heian no Futari was different is that the girls' sexuality was a point of conflict. Their relationship wasn't normalized the way Class S relationships seem to be. While resembling the Class S novels, like the ones by Nobuko Yoshiya, Shiroi Heian no Futari placed emphasis on the social issues of being queer in an unaccepting environment, and the ways that this judgment and internalized homophobia can tear people apart, and the grief and regret that comes with that. This focus on the social and psychological impacts fits right in with the introspective character studies that manga artists in the Year 24 group were bringing to shoujo. Riyoko Yamagishi was also helping shoujo evolve artistically, making use of a romantic style and heavy visual symbolism. We also see decorative elements on the page that I think has become pretty standard for shoujo. Seeing this art trend flesh itself out as the Year 24 group experimented is actually really cool, and one of my favorite parts of reading a lot of these vintage shoujo. While most of the members of the Year 24 group were exploring the deep psyche of their characters for the first time in shoujo manga, Riyoko Ikeda was playing in the melodrama and epicness of Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution, with her hit The Rose of Versailles, starting publication in Margaret magazine in 1972. The Rose of Versailles was shoujo manga's first major critical success. For the uninitiated, The Rose of Versailles follows the early life of Marie Antoinette and the royal guard Lady Oscar, as she grows up and learns more about the plight of the average French citizens as the French Revolution brews and eventually explodes. The series starts out in Marie Antoinette's point of view, but pretty early on we swap over to Oscar's point of view and Oscar becomes the main character. And Oscar isn't like the other girls. At least, she wasn't at the time of her creation. Oscar is brash, she's tough, she's a complex being, and she stands opposite of the demure, ideal lady that Japanese women were expected to be. While she isn't the first cross-dressing, knightly, princely woman to grace shoujo, she is the inspiration for the feisty, gender non-conforming heroine. Thank you, Lady Oscar, for existing and being the inspiration for Utena, my beloved girl boy boy girl. The series also is notable for its permanence of death. When a character died, often brutally and violently, since, it is the French Revolution, they were dead for good, which was notable because it had been common for shoujo manga to bring back their dead characters. The stakes could never be that serious, it could never be that sad. Which is funny to me because most of the early shoujo with death in it that I know are all from this era where the deaths are tragic and punching a hole through your heart and oh so horribly permanent. So that's kind of fun to know that Rose of Versailles is the reason that we all cry. The Rose of Versailles marks a shift in shoujo manga with its tone and the way the series is geared towards an aging shoujo audience, not just the kindergartners. While it is very melodramatic and soap opera-y, and at the start of the series does feel age appropriate for, I don't know, like 7 to 8-year-olds. It begins to be more complex as the series goes on and the French Revolution really brews into existence, and we see all of these political complexities and all of these things happening that maybe not be as interesting or a little over the head of your average, like, first grader. So this is a series that could definitely age with the readers, and as it goes on, definitely has more intrigue to an older audience. Riyoko Ikeda's Rococo-style artwork also showed just how far the demographic was coming, artistically, and the creativity that was flourishing during this era. The Rose of Versailles proved that shoujo manga was worth investing in, that it was able to capture the hearts of the general public. The Rose of Versailles was a hit from the very start, to the point that we have this series to thank for manga being sold in volume format. More accurately, its success influenced publishers to routinely release manga in the volume format, and it was one of the first shoujo to ever be released like that. And also, manga just wasn't released in volume formats all that often. While it did happen, most re-releases of chapters would be in the same format as magazines again. They would just get reprinted in the magazine. This meant that manga artists were only being paid per page when they would create their works and publish them in magazines. And of course, they would get a little reprint fee anytime their works were reprinted in the magazines. There were no royalties or anything like that, so regularly releasing manga volumes brings more income potential for the artist, royalties on the books that are sold. A detail of manga publishing that compounds in our history here. With The Rose of Versailles being a popular long-running series, which was also uncommon for shoujo, competing manga magazines had to cook up something to keep up. Most shoujo manga at the time were these shorter one-shots, so having a longer-running series like The Rose of Versailles was different, and other manga magazines wanted to cash in on that. Moto Hagio comes on the scene, and she changes lives, and was given the privilege to do so because Riyoko Ikeda's lightning in a bottle success with The Rose of Versailles, which also changed lives. Let me back up a bit. Moto Hagio kept cooking after the November Gymnasium. She wrote a gothic horror fantasy series about a teenage vampire called the Po Clan. This series is notable not just because it's good and I love vampires, but because the series, like The Rose of Versailles, was one of the first shoujo manga to be released in volumes, and the very first shoujo manga Shogakukan put out in the volume format. And it sold well. As the Po Clan went on, we get to watch in real time as Moto Hagio masters her craft of storytelling and artwork. The visuals and the heightened emotional storytelling is something I'd say is pretty indicative of her work, but she didn't start out perfect. As Moto Hagio worked to perfect her skill, people started to realize that shoujo manga actually was super cool and had a lot going for it. Male readers were interested in the Po Clan, and critics began to take this demographic seriously as Hagio and others like her crafted beautiful stories packed with complexities. If it feels like I repeat myself on that point, it's because I do. With each new complex shoujo manga, these manga artists are proving that this innovation wasn't a one-time fluke, wasn't some unique moment to never be recreated again. They proved that this was a change in the shoujo demographic that was here to stay. Also, just for like vampires in general, the Po Clan was one of the first series to depict vampires as tragic beings and romantic creatures, instead of predatory monsters that had been depicted in media. Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire is the book that's credited with popularizing the sympathetic vampire, and that didn't come out till 1976, after the Po Clan. I'm not saying they inspired each other, that's the timeline we're in. However, we have been beginning to sympathize with vampires all the way back in 1845 with Varney the Vampire, but vampires in manga were not super common, with Osamu Tezuka's The Vampires being the first vampire manga in 1966. So fun things were going on not only for shoujo, but also vampires with the Po Clan. At the same time as the Po Clan coming out in volume format, Moto Hagio was also tasked with coming up with a manga to rival The Rose of Versailles. And she told her publishers, look, all you're getting from me is a sci-fi or The Heart of Thomas. And her publishers chose The Heart of Thomas. The November Gymnasium got to make a comeback in its full glory with the Heart of Thomas. While Moto Hagio had included elements of Shonen Ai in the Po Clan, the Heart of Thomas would be the first Shonen Ai manga that wasn't a one-shot. The first long-running series about boys in love. While its contribution to the BL genre is the main thing of note for this series, the Heart of Thomas also solidified the shoujo style language. The series is credited for developing the distinct shoujo aesthetic with its page layout and the way the artwork was used to convey emotion and further the story. Who knew that the artwork in comics was not only a vehicle to tell the story, but also could be a part of the story itself? The use of visual metaphor, characters and scenes not bound by comic strips frames, slanting frames, commentary from the characters allowing the reader to be privy to their inner monologue, the large flowers that decorate the page, and of course the B-shonen characters. The beautiful and androgynous boys. B-shonen had been used before the Heart of Thomas, with Keiko Takemiya's Sunrumite and The Rose of Versailles being a foundational B-shonen work, but I'd say the more popular works that made use of this character archetype, the more established of a thing it became. As Owen from the Vampires SMP said that one time, let me be abundantly clear. Moto Hagio wasn't the only artist doing these things, but like I said earlier, with each artist contributing to these innovations, the more they prove that this is an actual shift in shoujo manga and not some fluke. All of these new ways of creating manga and telling a story visually were very prominent in the Heart of Thomas. The inner monologue and the visual metaphor, like depicting a character with angel wings and especially the use of flowers and flower petals, became a thing that set shoujo apart from other manga demographics. It's probably why shoujo feels like a genre in and of itself, despite only being a general age and gender demographic for marketing purposes. Shoujo is both an art genre and a demographic, and I think that's really cool. Despite all of this, the Heart of Thomas didn't do too well at first. Being a bit too complicated and over the readers' heads, the readers of the magazine were predominantly younger girls, and the Heart of Thomas was a bit over my head the first time I read this as a teenager, so like, girl, I get it. It was the least popular series running in Shukan Shoujo Comic, and Hagio was asked to cut the story short. However, Hagio was able to buy herself more time, negotiating an additional month. Just 2 months after the Heart of Thomas started publishing, Hagio's The Po Clan was released in volume format, and sold out of its initial print run in just 3 days. And I just want to convey to you how wild this is. In an interview I read with Moto Hagio, she was talking about how she really thought she was not going to be able to sell 30,000 copies at all. And her publishers were like, yeah, girl, we can do it. It might take a year or 2, but we can do it. And they sold out in 3 days. They didn't even think they were going to be able to do this in a year. That's pretty cool. At first, the sales didn't help her case, with her editors wanting to wrap up the Heart of Thomas in order to focus more on her successful series, the Po Clan. But she kept going, and the sales from the Po Clan did create more intrigue for Hagio's work at large, and brought readers into the Heart of Thomas. By the end of that summer, the Heart of Thomas was doing pretty good, moving up from least popular to 5th most popular work in Shukan Shoujo Comic, according to reader surveys. It is so cool to me how all of this works together. Firth inspired Hagio to publish her more risky ideas, since shoujo was changing. The Rose of Versailles brought volume releases, and the volume release sales of the Po Clan let Hagio continue the Heart of Thomas, which snowballs into establishing shoujo-style conventions and contributing to the establishment of Shonen Ai as a genre. And this isn't even counting how the personal relationships between the members of the Year 24 group and their other friends helped to inspire the works these women created and changed and shaped shoujo. But we're not done with the history quite yet. The history of shoujo manga and the history of BL manga are one and the same during the 1970s. While Moto Hagio continued to make waves with her work They Were 11, a science fiction story that won Shogakukan's manga award in 1975, competing against other shoujo and shonen manga, Keiko Takemiya continued to cook up her own demographic-defining works. Keiko Takemiya did not give up on her controversial Shonen Ai story. She continued to further her career, picking story ideas that were trending at the time, like the Wandering Noble formula used in her manga Pharaoh no Haka, producing works with mass appeal in order to gain more editorial freedom. and it eventually paid off. After nearly 7 years of work, Keiko Takemiya earned the right to publish Kazeruki no Uta, a series that has lived in my head rent-free for a decade. Kazeruki no Uta, funnily enough, was initially seen as a ripoff of The Heart of Thomas. Both stories shared similar influences, took place in an all-boys European boarding school in the Victorian era, and featured shonen ai themes and boys trying to deal with and heal from sexual trauma. They're basically the same story, but also they aren't. As Kazeruki no Uta went on and created its own identity, manga readers and artists alike began to see shonen ai as its own distinct genre. A genre totally dedicated to boys being in love, but not just any boys. Pretty androgynous boys that could also be girls depending on how you look at it. Kazeruki no Uta was not only popular by the end of it, but considered a masterpiece, impacting readers on a personal level, with Masaki Sato, a gay writer, claiming that manga like Kaze saved him. Kazeruki no Uta went on to be highly regarded, leaving some critics to mark it as a huge shift in comics comparable to notable works in the Parisian literary world. Kazeruki no Uta is also listed as inspiration on the widely known manga series Berserk. Kentaro Miura has gone on record to say that Kazeruki no Uta and the Rose of Versailles influenced his approach, swapping from the typical shonen manga formula to a story with sad and painful human relationships. Chihiro Saito, a part of the artist collective B Papas, believes that Kazeruki no Uta also heavily influenced Revolutionary Girl Utena, and well, yes, that makes sense to me. As a huge fan of both, this makes sense. It checks out. Kazeruki no Uta was that girl making history. The series popularized the shonen ai genre, but it was also long. It ended with 17 volumes, which later got released in a 10-volume omnibus kind of vibe. Which, 17 volumes is on the shorter end of the long manga spectrum, as I mentioned before, but long-running shoujo just was not the norm prior to the 1970s. Kazeruki no Uta is also notable for its depiction of sexual expression. It's been controversial since day one because of it as well, because the characters are teenagers, minors, and while teenagers do explore sexuality, some people are uncomfortable seeing that written on the page, but also Kazeruki no Uta was written for teenagers. So, I don't know. I feel like that should be taken into consideration, and for anyone who hasn't read it, it's really not that explicit compared to things we see in manga now. Is that a great defense? Probably not. But it's also not the crazy pornographic thing somebody might think hearing me talk about it like this if they've never seen it before. The art direction is very respectful, I guess, of the characters, and while the topics and the actions being depicted are mature and explicit, the way it's drawn is there's a lack of detail in the anatomy, and it's done in a way where it's a vehicle to tell you what's happening and less so of like, ooh, look at all this. Don't you want to get freaky with it? Am I making sense? I'm off script. I just wanted to say Kaze was controversial at its time. Probably still would be. I just wanted to say Kazeruki no Uta has been and always will be controversial. Even when it was publishing. And the fact that it was controversial to the extent that it was and still publishing, I think shows just how far shoujo manga had come during the 70s and how much those boundaries had been pushed and how much we had figured out what we could get away with publishing, the kinds of stories that could be told, and just where the restraints now lay. Kazeruki no Uta wasn't the first shoujo manga to explore sexuality and contain sexual content. That honor goes to Fire, being the first to have sexually explicit scenes in a post-World War II manga. Ever. I'm pretty sure it's manga period and not shoujo manga, so Fire is also that girl. But Kazeruki no Uta was unapologetic in its depiction of hypersexuality. The context of the story is incredibly sad and upsetting, but its depiction of sex made significant developments in shonen ai. It brought these kinds of stories into the light. What was previously almost exclusively self-published in the doujinshi scene was now being commercially published. And this new trend towards sex-focused narrative brought us the founding of a manga magazine, June, the first BL magazine. Kazutiki no Uta is considered by Kazuko Suzuki as one of the first attempts to depict true bonding or ideal relationships through pure male homosexual love. Kazutiki no Uta and The Heart of Thomas are holding hands as the two works helped create diverse male-male romance narratives in shoujo from the mid-70s and onwards. On Kaze's Tales, we have From Eroica with Love by Yasuko Aoki, which, despite coming out while Shonen Ai was solidifying itself as a thing, made itself different by not being about schoolboys. And while the characters are still gender non-conforming in some ways, they're also much more masculine than the characters in previous Shonen Ai works ever dreamed of being. This series is also long. 39 volumes long by the time this series went on hiatus in 2012. And as I said earlier, long shoujo manga like this wasn't really a thing. It definitely is now. Skip Beat is basically the shoujo version of One Piece. Long shoujo manga is not unheard of now, and I think it's because of these older series that were proving, hey, we could do this whole shoujo thing for longer than a few volumes. We could have a long-running series, and it'd do okay. A handful of the other Year 24 group members were notable for their contributions to the BL genre, expanding upon what Keiko Takemiya and Moto Hagio had established. However, many of their works were never translated into English, both officially or unofficially, as far as I could find, and there's just very little information that I was able to find. I only know English, so there is a language barrier here. As the 70s began to come to a close, shoujo manga was no longer a monolith of childish stories that weren't taken seriously. Instead, it was a marketing demographic full of different genres, different levels of maturity, and in-depth storytelling for children, adolescents, and young adults. While the Year 24 group made their waves, other manga artists did continue to create conventional shoujo manga, at least conventional for that era. There is a place for those lighthearted, seemingly childish stories, so being able to have it all is really nice. And shoujo magazines were starting to niche down, specializing on genre. Because, wow, who knew not all girls like the exact same things? And now that we have a robust community of manga for girls, it made sense to capitalize off of genre preferences, instead of throwing all of your eggs in a few mixed up baskets, hoping for the best. You could now go to a specific place for boys kissing, or science fiction, or romance, or fantasy, or supernatural stories. The day I realized that manga magazines often were split up by genre, and that many of my favorite series were all from one magazine, that realization changed lives. It became so much easier to find other series that I would mesh with. And shoujo manga girlies in the 70s and 80s were experiencing that with the genre specialization, and I think that's so cool. Shoujo manga also now had a discernible identity due to artistic innovation that the Year 24 group was pioneering. Innovations that would inspire new generations of manga artists, who would continue to call back and be inspired by the works we now talk about as monumental classic shoujos. I realized, as I did research for this video, and as the script progressively got longer, an in-depth look at everyone's careers may have been a bit ambitious, and difficult to do since I am not fluent in Japanese. There were a lot of members of this group that had very, very, very sparse information on English-speaking internet, at least. So we kind of ended up with the highlights and how things overall have changed. And I still think that the information I was able to find and have been able to share with you guys is cool, and I love to talk about it. Basically, all of my videos are either information I think is cool and really loved learning, or characters and media and patterns that I've been thinking about a lot and wanted to yap about. So this is it. My grand excuse to talk about shoujo manga history. And I'll be here again when I make a video about the actual stories of The Heart of Thomas and Kazutiki no Uta, and whatever else I finish reading and have a lot of thoughts about. Maybe even the Rose of Versailles if I'm feeling particularly interested in French history. Only time will tell. I have so many ideas, so many things to yap. Anyway, Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, because like over 80% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed, which is actually really wild. Not in the like you have to subscribe to me kind of way, but just kind of wild how the numbers lay out, you know? If you're also really into vintage shoujo, what's your favorite? Mine, I think, is The Heart of Thomas. I don't know. I love them all the same. So it really just depends on whatever I've read recently, or whatever I've been thinking about recently. But yeah, that's my Shoujo History Year 24 group video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video I make, whatever that may be. I will go ahead and say, in my BL video, there was quite a few people that said they wanted a Heart of Thomas and Kazukino Uta videos talking about the actual stories, not the impact on the industry, and I would love to do that, and I am going to do that. It's just going to take a little bit of time, because I need to reread both of those series. So they are coming, hopefully, at some point this year. I cannot promise a date on that. So please be patient with me, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!